What's up guys, Omid from CodeLab here, and welcome back to the second video in our series on React Native. And this one will be covering some of the core components that we like to use within React Native, plus a general apps file structure. So I've kind of gotten rid of the test project from our last video, and I'm now looking at the exact React Native app that is posted up on our GitHub for our boot camps. And the first thing that I'd kind of like to do is just kind of walk you guys through the general file structure, what's kind of different than a regular React app, and just kind of what's going on here. And then we will talk about the specific components and how you kind of actually just render like some basic code onto a screen. So the first thing to notice here when we click inside of this React Native folder right here, we got a few folders and a few files, many of which look very familiar and similar to our React app. So just kind of taking a quick glance over at things here, we got some folders and we kind of brush through these very quickly. So the first folder here is one called .expo, and this one is actually local specifically to your machine. Excuse me. So whenever you basically run an app on your web browser, or you try to view it in like some specific format, Expo has to do some work underneath the hood. So you'll notice like some specific like caching for like specific apps and like a bunch of different like weirdly hashed files. So you should never really have to look in here. Just know that this is the result of running your app basically. Expo Shared is something that you will see by pulling code down from GitHub. Again, you should never have to mess with this file. It's just Expo metadata and contents to make your app run properly. Node modules, skipping down here, the exact same thing as node modules in a regular React app. It's just the extra JavaScript libraries that you have to download to actually get your app to work. So no need to worry about that again. Assets, however, this is basically just for top-level assets for an app. So, something like the actual logo for your app, like when you click on it to launch on your homepage of like your iOS or your Android device, stuff like that goes here. This typically is not the place for actual images that you can find located like throughout an app, and we'll kind of discuss in our next video exactly where that kind of stuff should go. Just know this is like for top-level assets, like for metadata about your app specifically. Now, coming down here, we're going to skip app.js because this is your actual source code, so we'll come back to this. Here we see app.json. This is just some metadata about our app. Nothing too unfamiliar. You should, again, really never have to edit this. It's kind of just for hosting and putting like a final production version out onto like an app or a Google Play Store. This Babel config.js file here, Babel is just basically for transpiling and kind of changing JavaScript code between different versions. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's all that you really need to know. And you should probably never really have to edit this file either. Package.json kind of lists all of your dependencies and just some metadata again about your actual app itself. Again, something that you really shouldn't have to necessarily mess with. And then finally, we have yarn.lock here. This is very similar to the package lock JSON from our React app, or yarn.lock. It's basically the exact same thing, just using yarn instead of npm to download your packages. Pretty much identical. Now, again, to start your app, you do just type npm start into your terminal. And if you want to install packages from a third party, like let's say you want to install like pretty much any package that you can find out there on npm, it's the exact same command to install it. It will install it into your node modules and all that stuff. And just note that when you do pull stuff down from GitHub for the first time, you won't have this node modules folder. So you will have to run that quick npm install or yarn add command to install all of those dependencies for the first time. I have them on my system because I created this folder and this on my system basically. So now let's kind of go over some of the core components inside of the actual code that you use to render stuff on the screen. So I've kind of taken some code here and I've kind of have it all pre-written. I'll explain where this came from in a second. And we don't need to worry about any of the syntactical sugar here that's specific to React Native. But if we just look at this from a very high level, we notice that this code actually looks very dauntingly familiar to our React code from before. So as you can see up here, we have some high-level stuff where we're just kind of running some imports. Just like in a React app, you're importing your libraries from other external places. Here we have one being imported from React itself and from React Native itself, so pretty straightforward, simple stuff. Here we have an arrow function. This could be written exactly like the functions that we write in React, so we could just have like a function app. Here, it was just chosen to be written with the arrow syntax that JavaScript has for writing functions. It's the exact same thing either way. So again, just a function that returns some code. We'll ignore the code that's being returned from now. And if we come down to here, we'll see we have that function body end and your return statement end. And then we have the export default function name. And the function name here in this case was app. Again, very simple, pretty much just like the React stuff where you have your imports. you have your function that does some processing, and then it returns some code that right now kind of looks like JSX, kind of looks like HTML, and then you have your export default of that function to export out of this file. Now, this specific code right here, you'll notice again, this looks very similar to the HTML JSX style of code that you should hopefully be familiar with by now. So you can see we kind of have like an open tag that contains other tags inside of it. So like whatever this scroll view tag means, we have a bunch of other tags inside of it. And then those tags, they can have text inside of them, like an open text tag, some text and a close tag. They can also take arguments to them. Remember, like passing in props, just like how we did in our React video. Like you can pass in a source argument, whatever that means, with some weird looking arguments to it, a style argument, stuff like that. In general, it looks pretty similar. Now, we're not going to focus on styling in this video, but the general JSX syntax looks pretty similar. Now, to kind of break down exactly what that looks like, we are going to actually go right through React Native's documentation themselves, again, because it's very well said and it offers some really good visual examples that we'd like to go through. So just at a very, very high level, you're more than free to read this information if you want, but my goal is to kind of summarize and save you some time with it and just kind of break things down in plain English. So basically, in both Android and iOS, there is a concept of a view. And a view is basically like a building block of what shows up on the UI of a mobile app. It's just like a big rectangular element that could hold content inside of it. Now, there's different types of views, there's different ways to edit it, but if you want to think of it in web development terms, it's basically like a div. It's like a big container. And this section right here about native components kind of breaks down what I mentioned in the last video, where technically there is no such thing as an exact view on Android and iOS. They have their own different names and their own different APIs for that kind of stuff. So when you press compile and you actually try to view your app, React Native will do it will actually render those corresponding Android and iOS views because it knows what the view tag means in those specific contexts for you, which again is why React Native is so powerful. Now, this table right here is really why I personally love this article, because this shows 5 of the most basic and like constantly needed React Native UI components that you will need to use throughout your React Native development lifecycle. And it also shows, just for your own kind of reference, what those tags transpile down to when you develop and compile your code into both Android and iOS respective native versions, as well as what a web comparison is, so that you know kind of in a web context, if you're familiar with any web development at all, kind of what you're doing. I think that it really helps to put that stuff into perspective, and it also gives a nice brief description. So when we say view, for example, like I said, a view is just a div. Now, the important note to that is that you can't scroll through it. I'll explain in a sec. But basically, this transpiles down to Android's view group and iOS's UI view. You don't ever really need to know what that means on Android or iOS. Just know, again, that it's transpiling down to something different, specific for those two platforms, and they're taking care of all of that stuff for you. Now, the other 4 elements that you will really need, and that you actually probably noticed in a lot of the code that I was just showing you guys, is text. This basically just renders basic text for you. It's like a p tag. Image renders an image for you. It's just like the img image tag for web development. I'm going to skip this guy right here. Text input is basically just a text input box. It's like input with a type text in the web context pretty much. And scroll view is actually just a React Native view, but you can scroll through it. And the reason why this distinction is important is because on Android and iOS, being able to scroll and not being able to scroll in a view is 2 very different things API-wise when you're talking to the actual Android and iOS respective OSs. So for that reason, you have to make the distinction. If you want a static page that's not scrollable, you can just see what you can see on the screen and you can't scroll, you use a view. But if you want to give the user the ability to scroll down, if you think that there might be too much content on the page, you make a scroll view. This is like a regular div on a web app where you can actually scroll. Now down here is some sample code. This is actually the code that I pasted into VS Code, and I'm going to walk through that in a second. But I do just kind of want to, again, put this into everyone's mind that within React Native, there are those core components, which were the 5 that we were just looking at. So those are the core ones that React Native actually offers to you. Then there are also other ones that we can download from the community, kind of like we've explained in React. There's those ones you can find on like npm.js, for example. You can also build your own, which we of course will do as we go through and develop stuff. And that is all kind of a subset that's kind of built from those React components that we were seeing, and it functions in a very similar way. So going back to our code to give a very brief explanation, as you can see, the text functions pretty much the same. You're literally just putting like text in between it. And then you have a scroll view here, something that is scrollable, and then you have a view here, something that is not scrollable. So If the content here is bigger than the size of the phone, it's just going to overflow and the user will never know what was at the bottom of it. So you have to be very, very careful when using the view in comparison to the scroll view. So here I have some text. The next thing I have is an image. We're actually going to go over how images work more in the next video, so we can kind of ignore this for right now. And then down here, you can see I have my text input with a default value argument passed in as a prop. Now, you might be wondering what this style means. You can see it twice here. This is basically how we do CSS styling in React Native, because in React Native, it's not web development, remember again, so there technically is not a thing as CSS. It's almost identical in the way that it functions, but it's not technically CSS. So for that reason, you'll see these inline styles in a lot of React Native's code samples that they list on the website for you. And it's not actually CSS, it's React Native specific way of styling components. So that about does it for this video. Hopefully I will see you all in the next one. Thank you.